Okay, hello everybody, very warm welcome to today's webinar. I'm John Paget and I'm joined by Bethan and Vincent, and we're part of the senior team here at Open Velocity. We're a strategic marketing consultancy. We're also today joined by JT Bowlin, as currently Senior Director at Vendavo, a global software business that's focused on optimizing revenue and pricing strategies. And JT, we're delighted that you can join us because I know that beyond your current role, you've got a lifetime, quite literally a lifetime's worth of experience of talking about pricing. So yeah, we're delighted that you can join us. Now, this is the first time that you are joining us. We use these webinars as a way of being able to surface the questions that we get from clients. But if you have any questions for us that relates to today's content or any suggestions for future webinar topics, please do pop those in the chat. Now, if we don't get to answer those questions today, we'll be popping those along with a recording of today's webinar up on the Open Velocity website next week. Now, in terms of the format's pretty simple. There are 3 of us, there are 4 questions, and we have half an hour. So I think that's most of our preamble done. So I'm going to kick off, I guess, with the context of today. So we're talking about pricing strategy in B2B. And I guess before we talk about pricing strategy and how we might go about discussing the merits of various aspects of pricing strategy, we need to understand where pricing strategy sits and who has responsibility for it. So Bethan, I'm going to come to you first to kick us off. So where do you think pricing should sit within a business?
So I'm going to very selfishly say marketing, and the rationale for this is, I've been in organizations where it's been sat with the sales team, it's been sat with primarily just the CEO, or often it's sat with finance. And I think the challenge is there's often quite a myopic view of what pricing is, what it should be. And my view personally is that marketing is the kind of interface to the customer, right? We're the voice of the customer within organizations, and therefore we're the closest to the considerations of the customer around kind of pricing and what makes pricing attractive. So I'm not saying that those departments should be kind of excluded or individuals should be excluded from the pricing conversation, but it's definitely sat with marketing. But marketing has to be working with the array of stakeholders in order to come up with pricing decisions that make sense in terms of the context of the market, the organization, and the customer set. I don't know if that's anyone disagrees with that at all. I'm kind of interested to unpick that, I guess.
Yeah, well, I suspect as a fellow marketer, you and I are going to align very closely on this. But JT, I know that you've got some different thoughts on this. So maybe you'd like to tell us where you think pricing should sit.
Sure. I mean, it's one of those answers where it depends, right? Which I know is not a great answer, but there's some things that are more important about to look for where it sits. And I've worked in pricing under marketing, under sales, finance, product, commercial teams. It's kind of one of these things that can sit lots of different places. The key thing to look for, though, is independence. And that's really important in the pricing world. What you don't want is for example, for it to be under sales, and then sales comes over and taps on your shoulder and says, hey, we really need to drive some revenue. Let's slash all the prices. And then you feel obligated because they're your manager telling you, right? Because you work for sales. So I'd say it's more about maintaining that independence, regardless of where it sits. I would also say it's so important to the businessman. It's the number one most effective way to drive profitability into a company. It's much more effective than slashing your cost, for example. Managing your price better will drive better profitability. So for that reason, it should also have at least a dotted line into C-level, whether it's a CEO or someone on the C-level. It needs to be involved in senior discussions.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting point, that independence piece, isn't it? I mean, I think from my perspective, price is a fundamental part of the marketing mix. To get the textbooks out, it's one of the 4 Ps. But I think that point around the sales is really interesting, and that asymmetry of sales-based incentive. If the sales team are incentivized to get the sales in as opposed to a revenue number, then pricing comes under pressure. And I think that's a really, really important point. I think finance is another interesting one. I've worked in a business where finance has owned the pricing. And I think then the limitation is that everything is cost driven and not value driven. So I think that can affect can affect the outlook of how the pricing conversation then transpires. And I do believe it's sat in the marketing team, but I'd be open to persuasion that it could be a depends answer. I mean, I guess that leads us nicely into the second question then. So we're comfortable perhaps more with where it maybe shouldn't sit than perhaps where it absolutely should. What are the factors that are considered as part of that conversation and trying to start thinking about how you go about setting a pricing strategy? And maybe JT, it'd be good to get your thoughts on that to start with.
Yeah, I mean, that one, it's quite a big topic, that one. So I always look at these things, there's kind of two phases of pricing. There's the early phase, which is, how are you even going to charge for a product? You might call it monetization, right? So trying to figure out, is this going to be a subscription model, or is it going to be a usage model? Is it going to be a one-time model? Is it going to be a static price, a dynamic price? So try to figure out how you're going to charge for it. But then looking at everything around you. So I'll give you an example here. Let's say we're McDonald's, right? Let's say we're McDonald's, and we're trying to figure out, when we're launching a new burger, what to charge for that new burger. So it's not as simple as trying to figure out, that burger in isolation, what you should charge for it. You have to think of, how is it going to impact my other portfolio? And then wider than that, how is it going to stack up against competing products out there? And really trying to figure out all the market dynamics. And you can get into stuff like political atmosphere that can influence pricing on things. Obviously, goals of the company. And then identifying perceived value. Perceived value, I would say, for me personally, I'm very passionate about value, and I think that's the most important thing, is figure out what is it worth. And when you do that, not just relying on what the product team thinks it's worth or what the sales team thinks it's worth, that the only way to really know what something's worth is to talk to your customers or your prospects. That they will tell you what something is worth. As you can imagine, let's say the product team is inventors, right? So they've invented this thing. They're going to think it's the best thing ever. They're going to say, this is the best thing I've ever made. It's worth a fortune. And there might be 20 features on that. And I'm going to say all those features are awesome. And customers would pay a lot for all those. But you can't just take that, for granted. You have to go and talk to customers and say, actually, there's 20 things. I only care about 5. The rest is, I don't really care about. I want to pay for that. And, really understanding, the holistic value of your product, but also, feature by feature. And that does require some effort. That requires some pricing research, whether it's conjoint analysis or the different models. But I'd say that's the most important thing to me, but it's a big topic. There's a lot of things that can go in there.
Yeah. And sorry to jump in here, and I guess I'm kind of interested because obviously we're in a landscape now with inflationary pressure, and that's continuing. Yes, it's meant to taper off at the tail end of this year. So JT, is there also kind of a consideration of like the fundamental economic market you're operating in? And I guess with inflation in particular, because I know that's a huge concern for our clients and probably for people on this call, how would you suggest maybe approaching that? And I know that's quite a hard question.
Yeah, I mean, it is a hard question. So inflation is always interesting to me, whether customers kind of accept, for example, if you do an inflationary increase, it's when you're doing a price change. And, I got a letter the other day from, EE, my mobile phone company, says we're putting prices up 15% because of inflation. And that doesn't sit well with me, because I'm like, well, okay, I understand inflation, but you haven't added 15% more value to me. So I don't want to pay 15% more. And this is why when companies are looking at inflation and the challenges with that and wanting to increase price in relation to inflation, what I always recommend is try to bundle that in with some value increases at the same time. So it kind of grays the fact that you're just doing it as inflation. If you've added substantial value over the past year, and then you're increasing the price, and you can point out that value and demonstrate it, then the customer is less likely to challenge that. They'll kind of accept it. Now, this assumes they agree with you, again, it's perceived value, and they have to say, yes, I agree you've added value, not just you saying you added value, because you might well think you've added 15% more value, but maybe it's something that customers don't even care about. We've just convinced ourselves internally that, yeah, we've added a ton of value. So it's a game to play, but there's a framework I always run this past called the PESTEL framework, PESTEL. That's kind of a good one to consider. It's the same like if you're considering expanding into a new market, new country, region, whatever the case, you always need to understand, what's kind of the socioeconomic environment you're going into and the impact that could have on pricing.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess, sorry, just one other point on this strand I'm keen to get your thoughts on. What we're suggesting here is a lot of kind of, I guess, extra work for companies in going and understanding their customer, doing that analysis. I guess, how would you suggest, marketers in particular advocate for that? Because it can be hard, the company wants to make a decision, we want to raise our prices, and actually if marketing's coming in and saying, hey, actually we should probably think about this and take some time, how would you position that? Sorry, I'm co-opting the agenda a bit, I'm just intrigued.
Yeah, it's a good point. So if a company is not kind of used to doing this and it's something you're trying to convince them to do, then I always suggest just doing a pilot, or take a category of products and say, let us own that category, and let's do it properly and demonstrate that we can add extra profitability to the bottom line. When that's going on, just doing a conjoint on that product or not, because really, if you think about what a company's going to want, they're going to want commercial impact, right? That's primarily what people want with pricing, is how can we make more money? And it generally does that quite well. And it's something that if you've not done it before, then there's going to be low hanging fruit everywhere, all over the place. Like there's just going to be money to be made. And a prime example is usually like the long tail. Long tail is where it just doesn't get the focus, but it's also something that is not bought very often. And so customers will pay a premium for it. And a lot of people just don't realize that. Or you see things like if someone takes a networking category and they're like, we're going to charge cost plus 10% across all of this networking category. Well, in that networking category, you're going to have some very high end, networking mainframe servers that cost thousands of pounds, but you're also going to have some cheap networking cables that probably cost you, £1. And so you don't want to charge £1.10 for a cable. What's the point of that? What's the point of only making, 10 pence on a cable? So you kind of need to segment the category and price accordingly in relation to things, plus value on top, of course. So it's a complicated thing for sure, but I'd definitely say, do a pilot project, and generally speaking, there's going to be plenty of ways to make money and demonstrate that it works.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because the question around the factors that are considered as part of this conversation, the word value came up a lot. And I think that almost as a justification for our responses in part one, I think the marketers in the business have the best view of the value, the internal and external factors that affect how that value is perceived. I think that your point around the features, that's a really common one, isn't it? That, a product team or a product will have a lot of features that perhaps internally ascribes a much different value than what a customer is willing to pay. Mobile phones are the classic example. They can do a million things. Actually, we buy them for the 3 or 4 key things that we really need them to do. So that value is really important. I think that your point around the burger example as well, I think this feeds into our next question, but positioning from a marketing perspective is super important. And if we take a really basic example of a competitor map where you have price on one axis and quality on another, the price alone, it doesn't matter how you've got to it, but the price says something about the product in the marketplace, or the product or the service. And this can, affects or rather inflationary periods, price discounting, the people that you are competing against around a certain price point. All of that has a really big impact, not just on the demand for your product now, but also the likely demand for your product in the future. So I think I'd agree with you when you said it's a big question to answer in a handful of minutes. You have anything else that we want to add here, or should we move on to our next question?
Well, if your next question is about new process, kind of related to the other thing I want to say, which is that we're seeing a trend now in kind of the pricing is pretty consistent over the years in terms of strategy, but occasionally we get new things coming in, like AI and how it's going to impact pricing. And one of the things that businesses are realizing are not now, and I imagine see it in the marketing sphere as well, is getting pricing involved earlier in the process is a great thing. So let's say, for example, historically what would happen is part team would develop a product and they'd hand it over to the pricing team and say, here's this thing, can you please attach a price to it? What companies are realizing is bring pricing in earlier, and they can help early on identify what do we think is the ballpark price that's going to be charged for. And then they can do the market research and they can find, is there even a place for that product to sit, in the market dynamics going on. And it might be a matter of, we need a product that sits between, $200 and $300, for example. So product team, don't add, all the bells and whistles. It needs to sit in this little sweet spot here because that's an open place in the market we see. Or same with the features. Before they go off and build all these features, go out and test them with customers. Do some research and say, do you value this feature? And if no one values the feature, don't put it in the product. So, I think companies are really opening up to this now, that it's not just about pricing something after it's been created. It's bringing pricing more into the mix of that when the thing's actually being scoped out and built.
And Bethan, I guess we have sort of seamlessly moved into that next question of for a brand new product or service, so something that's coming to market that's not yet currently in market. What do you think some of the other considerations are, or maybe experience that you've got with clients that you've worked with?
Well, I think a really good example is actually ChatGPT, and not to kind of bring up the much hyped thing again for everyone, but that was really interesting when the discussions were having around when the Pro product was about to come out, about the price point of that. So, some people were saying, oh, it's going to be, $200 a month because that's the value it's delivering. And a lot of people were coalescing around the $40 to kind of $60 mark, but it's actually come out around the $20 a month mark. And I think you could very much see they were scrambling to monetize a product where they hadn't actually thought really much about the pricing strategy. And the perceived value also for that product changes dependent on the user type as well and the user cohort. So I think it's also understanding that your customers are not necessarily a homogenous group of people, and different customer cohorts will have a different perceived value and therefore will have a different price point. And that's why in SaaS pricing, or one of the reasons in SaaS pricing, you end up with those tiers, because you're trying to capture the different perceived value points for your customer set. So it's not just about understanding your competitors, your market, the market dynamics. It's also about understanding your customer segments as well. So, I would pay more than $20 a month for that product. I'm very happy. I don't have to, but I would. So they're missing out on profitability essentially because they've done one uniform price for everyone.
Yeah, and I maybe just throw in another example, because I think that particularly if it's a startup business and it's the first time that it's putting something in market, I think simplicity here is really important. And I think that a lot of time can be spent in trying to overcomplicate things. And rightly so. If, for instance, when we're working on a client, we'll do a lot of background work. We'll do, as you've been suggesting, JT, and we'll go and have a look at what else is in the marketplace, and that product price trade-off in terms of where this product or service might then play, or the brand might play, is all really important. But also it's just making sure that as you said, the price that you are going to assign a product or a service is at about the right place, and that you can establish something simply and clearly to customers before making it too difficult. I think SaaS businesses, there's a clear expectation of how a SaaS business models itself, right, in terms of its pricing strategy. But sometimes pricing is a really good opportunity of bucking the trend and being able to be different through pricing, So I think that's maybe another point, is that the product, the marketing mix the differentiation is often focused on the product. Actually, price is just as powerful a way of being able to differentiate a product as any of the other factors. So but simplicity is a key part to that. So I guess, anything else, JT, that you wanted to add into that, or should we move on to our last question?
I'll just say Bethan's point is very important in this discussion. So when we talk about perceived value, that varies. Like, we're all different. Like, if I ask you what's the most important feature on your phone, everyone in this session will probably have a slightly different thing to say about that. And but what you will see is you'll see kind of these clusters appearing of some people will have stuff in common with a lot of other people, and they have this cluster and this cluster and this cluster. And to make the most money, you would align with those clusters. So if there's a way to say, let's say there's people that value a product a bit lower than average, and people that value it in the middle, and people that value it a bit higher than average. So if you can create a monetization model which has a low, medium, high, and then those people align with that and they buy that, that's going to make you a lot more money than having one price for everyone. Because that one price for everyone, those people that are on the low value, they just won't buy the product because they're going to say you're charging too much for what it's worth. And the people on the high side, they'll say, thank you very much, I would have paid more, but I'll pay this little amount that you're charging. So it's really about identifying the value, but then also matching that with a monetization model that optimizes that.
And I guess that ties quite nicely into then the last question, which is, how do you know you've got your pricing strategy correct? How do you know that it's effective? Maybe Bethan, why don't you kick us off with that?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so you're talking to someone here who spent a lot of their career selling services, so not necessarily a product. And I got some interesting kind of piece of wisdom very early on in my kind of sales part of my career was if you start off with an initial price and you don't get a bit of then you price too low. And I think it depends whether you're in a situation where there is a degree of negotiation, or this is a flat price. There's no negotiation here. You just buy, you convert on site or wherever. So if you're a service-based business, you're looking for that. Where if you're a product-based business, you're looking for obviously that kind of decent conversion rate and enough kind of profit for you as a business to make it make sense. I've worked in businesses where we've actually done some kind of pricing, sales kind of modeling, and we worked out the more of a specific product line we were selling, the more money we were losing, because there just wasn't a margin enough in that product to carry our cost per acquisition. So that was quite an interesting dynamic as well. So, ultimately you're looking to generate revenue and profit for your business if we want to be productive about it.
And JT, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's a bit of a challenging one for me because it's something that there's so many factors that can impact pricing and profitability that what might be right today, tomorrow you'll see the numbers shifting and trying to figure out why is it? Was it the price? Did our competitors do something? Was it some fluke thing in the news that's scaring people off buying stuff, and really trying to figure it out. And that's why I always go back to value. You tell us a lot, but if you really understand the value, really understand it, and you monitor it and you adjust as that changes, and then you price relative to that value, things should work, right? Because, for example, if a competitor drops their price and then the market is aware of that, the value of your product will probably go down because they're like, well, now, your differential isn't aligned with the market. So unfortunately, your product is worth less. And this is always challenging for a company because, you can imagine if you have you and 3 other competitors and you're all, you're not price fixing, but you're all kind of playing in this sphere up here. And then you have someone new to the market and they come in down here and they're just shaking up the market. What that does is it just kind of destroys the market because it starts bringing it down to being commoditized, and it takes profitability out of everyone. But that sometimes happens, and you do have to usually react to that unless you can demonstrate that you have enough value differential. So, when a new entrant comes in, for example, you can say, well, they don't have the experience in the industry. They don't have the quality they've built up over the year, and you can really try to challenge it and say that means our brand is worth something. It's not just about the product, but the brand is worth something. And an example here, I always talk about my wife's handbag. She likes expensive handbags, and it drives me a bit nuts, to be honest, but it's a good pricing experiment, because when she goes and buys an expensive Prada handbag, I'm like, why did you pay so much money for that? But she will demonstrate, well, because it means so much to me, because I'm going to use it all the time, because it makes me stand out, all this stuff. And I'm like, okay, so you value all this stuff that I personally don't value, but you value it, and that's fine. So that means it's worth that price to you. And it really, again, goes back to value. It's like, you hear me say it over and over, but it's so important to understand what to set a price at. You need to understand what it's worth.
Yeah, and I guess that's a great example, JT. I love it. I think maybe just another point I might add in here is that I think understanding the reasons why your customers aren't buying from you, I think is a really powerful way. I mean, I think it's just really good advice, full stop. But I think it can have a really powerful, sort of give you some really powerful insights into whether you've got your pricing at about right. And it comes down to understanding also the perception that your customers or your target market has of you versus the competitors, right? And we haven't really touched on elasticity of demand, but if there are lots of substitutes out there that look and sound a lot like you, and you haven't got that brand to differentiate you, then any increase in price is going to likely lead to people going and buying the substitute products. And so it comes back to that positioning, and also, as you were saying, JT, that whether you've got that differential in your brand to be able to sustain a higher price.
Yeah, I think so. And I think one thing that all companies I've ever worked with really struggle with is if the perceived value is coming down, dropping that price to align with the value. Companies really struggle with it. They love to put the price up, right? When the perceived value is up, let's put the price up. But when it moves the other way, companies are very resistant to dropping the price to match the value. And unfortunately, that's not going to make them as much money as if they have just adjusted now. Also, there could be constraints like you don't want to price below cost, for example. But at that point, maybe it's end of life for that product. If it reaches a point when you can't charge what you need to make that profitable, you got to let it go, or figure out a way to add more value to that product that puts it back on the radar. But yeah, that's something that a lot of companies struggle with. They only look to put prices up, and they don't look to put prices down when the value decreases.
Yeah, I'm very aware that 28 minutes has just flown by, but Bethan, did you have any sort of final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I think it's one of those subjects where we could dig into it and go into different aspects of it forever. And I think the elasticity thing and the demand considerations are important, especially at the moment. We're, again, linked to the economic conditions we're seeing demand drop in markets, and companies kind of scrambling and struggling what to do around that. And I guess pricing, as we're discussing here, is another lever you can pull, but you've got to be careful about how you do it.
Yeah, I guess maybe that's a nice place to end. I mean, JT, have you got any thoughts on when demand does start to drop, how price often gets used?
I'd say don't do anything drastic in regards to the market, right? So just because the market's changing and things are getting tough, it doesn't mean start slashing prices to try to get some quick revenue in. You got to hold firm. I know it's hard, but this is a long game, really. And unless you, again, see that your values drops, but a lot of times it hasn't, hold firm and stick to your pricing strategy that you've laid out.
Yeah, I think that's such important advice. I think it's I think it's been shown over a number of research studies how damaging putting your price down can be in terms of how it repositions you. It's also really difficult to re-establish that value if you drop your prices for anything more than a very short period, perhaps just to stimulate something. But if you then start to anchor your price at a lower price point, putting it back up later is almost impossible to do. In addition to the fact that if you drop your price and everybody else does in the market, all you've done is the equilibrium price has dropped and no one else is better off. So there's all sorts of challenges with dropping price, as hard as it might be. Brilliant. I think we're going to stop it there. We could go on. I know, JT, a huge thank you for joining us on that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for everybody that's joined us. I hope you really enjoyed it. I've seen a few questions that have popped up. We will get to those and post the recording of this and some answers to those questions if we haven't covered them, as I said, at openvelocity.co.uk next week. And just a quick plug that we post our upcoming webinars and our blogs on LinkedIn. So please do go find us on LinkedIn to stay up to date. But for now, that's it. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Bethan. Thank you, JT. We'll see you all soon. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.